In this episode, I'm talking with Settareh. She speaks to the birth of her two sons. Her first birth was managed by medical midwives, and during that pregnancy, Settareh struggled with HG, hyperemesis gravidarum, feeling nauseous and throwing up multiple times a day. Instead of having a natural and undisturbed start to this birth, Setta was directed by her medical midwives to use at-home induction methods to start her process. The whole birthing experience was filled with chaos, fear, and being berated, which ultimately left Setta with trauma that she was continually gaslit for when trying to express her feelings. In the summer of 2020, after a transformative experience with 5MEO-DMT, Settareh was filled with peace and gratitude for everything that she had experienced. With asking to carry this experience of ceremony into her daily life, Settareh soon found out that she was pregnant with her second son. Have a listen to Setta's journey of both of her birth experiences, including driving for 2 hours in her active birthing phase to make it to her own home. Settareh was attended to by a medical midwife in this second birth, but she was able to make her request absolutely clear of what she wanted and what she didn't want, so that she would be attended to by her birth support in the way that she wanted, instead of bringing this baby into the world with only herself and her 5-year-old son. Hello, Settareh. Welcome to the Free Birthing in Color podcast. I'm so grateful that you have come and you've joined me and that you're sharing your stories today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
No worries. So I want to get straight into it. And the first question I would love to ask you is, what is your ancestry and the lineage that you are passing on to your children?
Sure. So both of my parents and basically all of their family were born in Iran. And so with everything going on right now, there's a lot of confusion, I think, about Iranian culture. But growing up, my family always said that we were Persian. And I feel like that's important to state because there is definitely a difference between what Persian culture has traditionally been throughout millennia and what Iranian culture is now. And so, yes, they were born in Iran, but we definitely grew up being told and learning about our Persian lineage.
Okay, wow. Okay, thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then the next question that I'd like to get into is, where does your motherhood journey begin?
Wow. So to do the whole cycle justice, I would have to start when I was 22. So I had a pregnancy that was very unexpected and in the midst of what I can only call a very toxic and painful karmic dynamic with the person that I was with at the time. And I chose to release that pregnancy. And I do tell that part of the story now because even though I carried so much shame around it for nearly a decade, honestly, I never spoke about it at all.
Mhm.
I feel like it's an important thing to share because I didn't recognize until having my other two children that that little soul that was with me for however much amount of time it was, I think like 6 or 7 weeks. For those 6 or 7 weeks, I was still a mother.
Right.
And I feel like that's important to share and to give reverence to. And it's interesting because at that point in my life, I didn't know any of the things that I know now.
Mhm.
And so had that pregnancy gone all the way through, I inevitably would have ended up with a hospital birth, possibly a C-section, so much more trauma. The baby ending up with so much more trauma and the
Mm.
whole dynamic that was that relationship. And so I really, I really didn't see myself as a mother figure. And then several years later, about 3 years later, I got pregnant unexpectedly again
Mhm.
with my second son.
Okay.
Uh, and or with my first son, I'm sorry. And he has just been my teacher from the very beginning. The pregnancy was very, very difficult. I was still in the system at that point. I had a midwife, working with an OBGYN, even though I only saw the midwife. She was a nurse midwife, so I had all of the tests, all of those types of things, the ultrasounds, everything you can imagine. And so pregnancy for me was very challenging. I was very, very sick the whole time, ended up hospitalized 2 or 3 times because of hyperemesis.
Wow.
Gravidarum. So I actually lost weight during my first trimester. It was a lot. And I didn't really have a grasp on understanding what was happening to my body. And that's the paradigm that I was in, that this was all happening to me
Right.
because I just wanted to be saved from it. I wanted to be saved from the nausea. I wanted to be saved from the whole unexpected chaos of like the interpersonal dynamics that I had going on. And that very much reflected it throughout my pregnancy and birth experience. And so my sickness, whatever you want to call it, those symptoms never subsided from before I found out that I was pregnant until the moment that I gave birth. I was throwing up multiple times a day. And
Wow.
for anybody who's experienced that, it's basically like you drank way too much the night before, except no matter what you do, the feeling doesn't go away. So they had me on medication. They had me do homeopathics, everything at that point that I knew of, and nothing really helped. The medication did help in the sense that I was able to eat. But whether it was the medication or what I was eating, I'm not sure. I ended up gaining 90 pounds with that pregnancy,
Wow.
even though I was throwing up so many times a day. So that was very difficult. And then going into my final trimester, I was put on bed rest around 34-ish weeks because I started having contractions.
Okay.
And then after all of that and all of that drama, he ended up coming at 40 weeks and 3 days. And right around 39 weeks, the midwife started talking to me about, natural inductions.
Yeah.
And how can we get this process moving along? Because you're a first time mother and we don't want you to go over your due date because then we can't treat you and you have to go to the hospital and the whole spiel. And so I consented because of course I didn't want to be intervened with, but even more than that, I did not want to end up in the hospital. That was my ultimate fear and what I wanted to avoid. And so I was willing to go along with whatever they told me was necessary in order to just essentially get it over with. And
Yeah.
it's such a struggle even admitting this because it's so far removed from everything that I understand now. But that was honestly just the place that I was in. I had so much fear surrounding birth, despite, taking the classes and talking to my midwives and so many appointments and so many ultrasounds. I honestly felt so disconnected. I knew that I was pregnant, but that was kind of where that connection ended. I didn't have this intuitive sense of the mother baby connection. I just knew, okay, well, in order to get this baby out of me, I have to give birth.
Right.
And I had so much fear surrounding that. So going into labor, I had done a membrane sweep. I had taken the homeopathic, I want to say it was black cohosh and blue cohosh and one other one I can't remember. And I was doing all of this together and then went and got an induction massage, and some combination of all of those things led to labor starting. Well, I didn't know if I was going to know when the real thing started because I had had these contractions for about 6 weeks prior, on and off. But when it started for real, it was instantly so painful that I couldn't get a handle on it. They were coming not that regularly at first, probably about like every 7 minutes apart, but every single one was taking my breath away, and it was so immensely painful. And that was basically the story of my entire birth with him. I definitely had some experiences of like an altered state of consciousness with his birth as well, but I would say it was more of a dissociative state. It was not the embodied like transformative state that I experienced With
Mm-hmm.
my second birth, it was more just total overwhelm from the pain, from the midwives barking orders at me, from them changing shifts and like staff during the middle of my labor process. It was all incredibly overwhelming. And
So
so,
were you in a birth center then?
yes,
Yeah.
sorry, I forgot to clarify. I was in a birth center. And they they basically just treated me like a little child. And quite honestly, I felt that way. I felt like I had no control over what was happening to my body, or any of that. And by the time he was actually born, I was so disoriented, that it was very difficult for me to like come back to reality. And at that point, the midwife, I'm not clear if I was hemorrhaging or she was trying to keep me from hemorrhaging, but she started doing a fundal massage,
Wow.
which was
Yeah.
the most painful thing I have ever experienced, more than the actual labor, all of it combined.
Mm.
Because it's, basically pressing on this giant wound
Yeah.
inside of me. And at that point, I think I did start to hemorrhage. So I needed 2 IV bags, couldn't get out of bed, could barely hold my son, and that whole first day was essentially a blur.
Yeah, that's terrible. Oh
Yeah.
God. Wow.
And I had a lot of resentment about that for a long time, and wanted to villainize them. And it was very easy to do so, because going into a birth center, you're sold this rhetoric of it being a totally natural experience, and it's not a hospital birth, and you
Mm.
get to do it naturally, whatever natural means, which essentially was without an epidural and without an episiotomy. But every single other intervention that exists within like the realm of birth in a medical sense
Mhm.
occurred during my birth process, even though I was told so many times, no, that's not going to be necessary. We can follow your birth plan. But I didn't get delayed cord clamping. I didn't get um to push in the position that I wanted to because they kept telling me like where to go. And honestly, by that point, I was so exhausted. I just wanted him
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Um, and I was so angry because I felt like I had been lied to, and I felt like I had been robbed of something. I didn't know quite what it was because at this point in my life, I didn't know anybody who had ever had a painless, ecstatic, or even like transformative birth. Everything I knew about birth was, there's some that are less traumatic than others, but
Yeah.
all of it is like within this spectrum of pain and trauma, and that's just how birth goes.
Right.
Um,
And isn't that a
uh,
terrible spectrum that women have? Like you will have your baby and you will have lots of pain and you will have some degree of trauma. Like that's it. That's all that they are told and taught and know of. Like that's just unbelievably insane that that's the spectrum of birth that most women see these days. Oh.
yeah. And it was really more difficult for me because I knew that was a possibility. And so I hired a doula, which I thought was going to save me from
Mm.
whatever immense trauma could happen.
Mm.
But I hired a doula who worked for the birth center, and
Okay.
I
Yeah. Mm.
didn't really put two and two together. And it wasn't until after the birth when I tried to confide in her, I don't feel like that went well. I feel very violated. I feel like I was lied to. I feel very traumatized. And she essentially dismissed me, like everyone did for years, whenever I tried to talk about aspects of the story that I felt disempowered by or just blatantly violated by.
Mhm.
um, the worst of which for me was when they kept telling me to push because I was at 10 centimeters. I didn't feel the need to push. I was on my back in a bathtub and just exhausted.
Mhm.
Um, and the midwife who was on call at that time was getting irritated with me because she had just attended a birth and been up for the last 24 hours. And
Right.
so she just wanted to move things along.
Mhm.
Um, and she told me that if she broke my waters, that it would speed things up. Well, what that actually ended up doing was causing my son to aspirate some of the fluid. And so when he was born, instead of getting to hold him and have the skin to skin and the delayed cord clamping, they immediately took him away, cut the cord, suctioned him, the whole deal. And about 8 minutes before he was born, so he was born at 8:08 in the morning. At 8 a.m., the midwife got up, announced to everyone in the room that she was leaving, and a new midwife came in and helped me to birth my son. And that was such a mind-blowing thing for me, because I'm completely exposed and naked in this bathtub, literally minutes away from giving birth. And this woman who's supposed to be holding space for me and supporting me, who has been berating me for this entire time, just gets up and leaves. And I think I would have been more frustrated and irritated had she actually been more helpful. But at that point, I just felt relief that she was gone. And
totally. Wow.
I think my body in some way held out for the other midwife to come, because I don't know, that's the only thing I can think of, because that stage, that last stage after transition, when they just kept telling me to push during every contraction and I didn't really know why or what was happening, it didn't feel like anything was happening. And it was so like disembodied. I don't know how to explain it. Like, obviously I knew on some conscious level that I was giving birth and a baby was about to come out, but it was so chaotic that it took me like probably a full 30 seconds after they handed him to me to understand like what had just happened, because the level of pain and fear that I was experiencing just took me to this completely other place. And yeah, so it was years. My children are 5.5 years apart, and it was years and years before I felt like I could even tell the story without crying. Because whenever I tried to tell it at first, people just said, yeah, well, that's just what happens in birth. And at least you didn't go to the hospital, and at least you didn't get an episiotomy, and at least you have a healthy baby.
Yeah.
And I feel like that last one hurt the most, because I did start to feel like talking about the experience that I had in his birth would somehow mean that I wasn't appreciative of motherhood and not appreciative of this beautiful little child that I now had. But both of those things were true. It was a traumatic experience for me, and also therefore for him. And I was so grateful to be a mother. And I really didn't know how to hold that duality for years and years. And then in the summer of 2020, so July of 2020, I had the chance to do a 5MEO-DMT ceremony. And this is an essential part of my second birth story, because prior to this, I had experience with plant medicines and altered states of consciousness through meditation and yoga and things like that. But the 5MEO-DMT took me to a place within myself and within the cosmos that I didn't think existed. For lack of better terminology, it was basically like meeting myself as goddess, as God, whatever you want to call it. And coming out of that state, I had more peace and just more gratitude for everything that had happened, all of the things that I considered traumatic, all the things that I considered painful, and coming back into like regular waking consciousness. I remember asking to just be a vessel, to just have the opportunity to carry what I had experienced in this ceremony with me into daily life. And the way that that was answered for me was with another pregnancy.
Right.
Which, to be completely honest, when I all 3 times that I was pregnant, I knew before ever taking a test. I was in that place still where I needed the confirmation. I needed like some proof to prove my intuition. But I remember it was a full moon in August of 2020. It was August 4th, and I'm staring at the full moon, just outside. It's this gorgeous, clear night. And this total like awareness comes over me. And it was just so clear, like this conversation that you and I are having, you're pregnant. And
Wow.
it took me a second because it was just so unexpected and, to be honest, quite chaotic, because my ex-partner and I were not in a place where having a child would be even a feasible thing.
Right.
And I panicked, and all of the birth trauma and everything from both experiences came right up. And I had this overwhelming sense of there's no way that I can do this. All of this, and it's 2020, so the whole world is falling apart. And I am just reeling because I don't understand how it can be possible that I can hold this.
Right.
And I almost didn't go through with that pregnancy. I almost didn't have my second son. And even saying that and admitting that is almost a scary thing, because his birth was maybe the most transformative event of my life. But I almost couldn't hold it. And to be honest, the thing that stopped me, I booked the appointment and I had every intention of going. But that was the same week that there were all of these crazy wildfires in Southern California, and there were riots everywhere because of what was going on in the United States at the time. And the whole world honestly seemed like it was just burning.
Yeah, I remember.
Literally burning. And I was paralyzed with fear of like leaving the house or doing anything. And so that day that I was supposed to go to the appointment, I just sat there and kind of sat and reflected and didn't really know what I was going to do. But I kind of stayed in that place of not really knowing what I was going to do, really until the end of that year, until the end of 2020. And it wasn't until I made the decision to leave my ex-partner and this reality hit me that I would be doing it on my own, that I started to understand that it had to be different. So there was never one hesitation in my mind of I might end up needing to go to the hospital. I might end up with another traumatic birth. Once I was on my own and once I accepted the pain of that, I knew that I was willing to do absolutely anything to make sure that the experience was different. And so I signed up for prenatal yoga training. That was a doula training, and did that. Felt a little frustrated with that whole process, because the doula training itself was very much like a medicalized birth doula training. And it still just it seemed to reiterate those same principles and things that I had heard during my first birth experience that I knew the reality of the outcome of, because it sounds great. It sounds great to have a birth plan and practice like birthing positions and the ball and breathing techniques and all of that. But I knew that there had to be something else. And I remember during the training, there was a traditional midwife who worked in South America, and she came on and just spoke to us for a few hours about her experiences as a midwife and working in a very remote village where the nearest hospital was 6 hours away. So hospital is not an option for anybody. And hearing her stories and hearing about how she learned through her work there that just not touching at all and just holding space created the opportunity for these women to go through essentially this rite of passage in birth. And I remember being in this training, in this lecture, and I had to turn off my camera because my mouth was just gaping open, and I couldn't believe the words that were coming out of this woman's mouth, because I had never heard anybody talk about birth in this way. And so I became addicted. I bought every single like unassisted, more like natural birth book I could think of. I found Free Birth Society, Indie Birth, like all of the big birth things on Instagram, and I immersed myself. And I remember the one that stood out to me the most was Orgasmic Birth, the book. And at the time I wanted to order it, it was not for sale anywhere. And so I paid like $50 to have this tiny little paperback book shipped from Italy
Oh,
because
wow.
it was the only place that had it. Now you can get it on Amazon for $17, of course, but I remember sitting and just reading that book every single day and telling myself over and over again, like, birth can be amazing. Birth can be pleasurable, birth can be transformative. And I refused to believe anything else. And towards the end of that doula training, I realized that the place that I was living wasn't really conducive to this environment that I wanted to create for my birth. And so I made what seemed to everyone the absolutely insane decision to move 12 hours away by myself to a state where I didn't know anybody at 8 months pregnant. And so
Wow.
I did it at 33 weeks pregnant on Valentine's Day of 2021. I moved to Idaho
Wow.
and I got this beautiful 3-bedroom house. And it was just me and my then 5-year-old and my cat.
Mm.
And I ended up finding a midwife who was a licensed midwife, but I was very clear with her from the beginning. This is what I want out of my birth. I do not consent to any tests. I do not consent to any ultrasounds. I don't want a Doppler. I don't want you to touch me while I'm in labor. I don't want any cervical checks ever.
Mhm.
And she said, okay, to all of it. And so I moved there. I hired her. I found my doula 2 days before I ended up giving birth. And
Wow.
then we end up on Easter Sunday of
Mhm.
2021. And, I was 39 weeks in a day, I think, based on the calendar.
Mhm.
Um, and I woke up that morning and I was uncomfortable. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. I was never in pain. I
Oh,
didn't have,
sorry,
yeah.
before we get into it, just in your pregnancy journey, did you have the HG again, or were you okay this time around?
So starting out, I had it not as badly as I did with my first son, but I I just didn't have like any prenatal care really. I lived in the middle of nowhere at the time in Ramona in California. All the midwives that I talked to wouldn't let me take my son to appointments, and I didn't have anybody to watch him. And every single daycare, school, everything in Southern California was closed.
Mhm.
Um, and so I chose not to go to appointments. I did end up talking to one midwife who wrote a letter for me because I had gotten so sick that I couldn't work. And then I took some time off of work and then I got laid off.
Wow.
And this was at the very beginning of my pregnancy. And so I had 2 appointments with a midwife just so she could write me a note for SDI benefits.
Mhm.
And so based on that, I ended up getting one ultrasound, the anatomy scan at around 20 weeks, and immediately regretted it. Wish that I didn't do it, didn't feel any better about it.
Mhm.
Um, and that was basically it. But I still just didn't feel right until the day I moved to Idaho. And I don't know how else to explain this because obviously HG isn't completely an emotionally based thing.
Mhm.
But I moved to Idaho and every single symptom disappeared. I mean, I didn't even have like pain. I didn't have trouble sleeping. I didn't have any nausea. It was like I uprooted my entire life and took this crazy chance that it just had to be better. And my body immediately responded and was like, okay, yes.
Wow. I love that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that last like month or so, like 9 weeks that we were in, or 6 weeks, sorry, that we were in Idaho, those last 6 weeks of my pregnancy were a dream.
Mm.
And it was just so odd to me because I was so used to feeling absolutely horrible, like crippled with nausea, having to force myself to eat, having to force myself to drink water. And I mean, my 5-year-old and I were going on like 2-mile walks and driving up to Sun Valley to go on a ski lift ride and like doing all these things that I wouldn't have dreamed of doing when I was pregnant the first time.
Mhm.
Um, And I kind of just got lulled into the sense of, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. I stopped really planning for birth at all. I mean, I had my supplies and I had my midwife, and at the 30, I think it was 37-week meeting that we had, I wouldn't even call it an appointment because she would show up, we would talk for like half an hour, she'd take my blood pressure and my pulse and palpate my belly, listen with the fetoscope, and that was it. And it was wonderful because I didn't feel managed. I just knew, okay, if I need it, if anything were to happen, this woman is just going to hold that space for me. So I'm not giving birth alone with a 5-year-old, which at this point would basically be my only other option, because I had wanted to have a unassisted birth. But all of my friends and family at the time who I talked to about that thought I was insane. They already thought I was pretty crazy for wanting to birth at home because of all the problems that I had during my first pregnancy and birth. And I say problems with air quotes because I didn't hemorrhage with my second birth. And so was it that I actually had a hemorrhage problem, or was it the mountain of interventions I went through? Like,
yeah, and having your uterus pounded on after birth.
Yeah, who really knows? And, also all of the natural induction methods. I know now too, like if you're disturbing anything about the physiological birth process, it's going to respond. And it's typically not going to respond in a way that's positive with your body or your baby. And so there were just so many things. And this time around, there was none of them. My midwife did mention maybe once or twice about the 42-week rule and how I couldn't go past and she wouldn't be able to help me. And I didn't really think of it at all. I kind of just had this thought in my mind, well, if I go past the 42 weeks, I'm just going to do it by myself. I'm not going to go to a hospital. I'm not even considering any of those things. And so I didn't do any of the herbs or the homeopathics or the pressure points. I did nothing to try to induce labor. I just lived my life, essentially. And then 39 weeks in one day. So it was Easter Sunday. And because I was feeling fantastic, the night before we had driven 2 hours to Boise, which was about 2 hours from where I lived in Twin Falls. But it's not like a straight shot. It's like through windy country roads. And the drive was a little gnarly at 39 weeks pregnant. And so we chose to stay at my friend's house that night. And I wake up in the morning, Easter morning, and I'm just uncomfortable. And I had been having tightening sensations, the like Braxton Hicks, whatever you want to call them, only for the last couple days. Up until this point, I had absolutely no signs of like early labor, nothing at all. Never lost my mucus plug, didn't have my water break, didn't have like any other physiological changes in my body, didn't throw up, didn't have diarrhea, nothing. And so I didn't think it was at all possible to go into labor, because with my first birth, I had all of those things for weeks and weeks and weeks leading up to the actual birth. And so I'm at her house and she's doing this little Easter thing for all of our kids. And she keeps looking over at me because I'm kind of quiet and I'm not saying anything. And she starts timing these sensations that I'm having without saying anything. And at about 9:30, she looks me dead in the eye and says, "You're in labor." And I just kind of laughed at her. I'm like, that is ridiculous. And I explained to her why this didn't happen, this didn't happen, this didn't happen. And my number one thing was, I'm not in pain. And she just looked at me. She's like, "Look, you can either drive home right now, or you're going to have your baby in this house, or you're going to have to go to the hospital. Like, there's just no, I'm telling you right now, you're in labor." And so we waited for probably another 15 minutes. And at this point, like every 5 minutes on the dot, I was having a sensation. And I did go into a brief moment of panic because I now realized that my options were birth in my friend's house, which really was not an option. She was not comfortable with that, and neither was I. So my options were birth in a hospital or drive home. And my midwife wouldn't have been able to come. My doula wouldn't have been able to come because I'm 2 hours away from where everybody is. And I decided, like, this is not going to be my birth story again. I'm not going to have another chaotic, traumatic birth story. And so I chose to drive home in active labor because, at
Wow.
5 minutes apart, those surges, like that's considered active labor. That's when they tell you, call your midwife, go to the hospital, do whatever it is you're going to do. But now you're having a baby.
Yeah.
And for those 2 hours, I just, I refuse to believe anything at all other than I'm driving this car. Like nothing about the fact that my body was in labor was allowed to register in my mind, because when I first started driving, that started to happen and I was just in full panic. I was like white knuckle gripping the steering wheel and my 5-year-old's in the back seat. And so of course the other thing going through my head is, if like one of these sensation gets too strong and I crash the car, he's going to get hurt. I'm going to get hurt. This baby's going to get hurt. And all of this is going through my head. And so I pull over at a gas station. I'm literally shaking because I'm just so panicky.
Mm.
And I smacked myself. And I was like, you need to get it together because you have to drive this car home. There's
Wow.
absolutely no other option. And I called a friend of mine who stayed on the phone with me for the entire 2 hours. And I just told my mind over and over again, you're driving a car, you're driving a car, you're driving a car. And somehow pulled into the driveway of my house
Mhm.
2 and something hours later. And as soon as I did, I stepped out of the car and just the strongest sensation hit me. And I had to like grip onto the front seat and was just breathing through it. And I was like, okay, I guess this is actually happening.
Wow.
And I still to this day cannot really explain to you how driving that car was possible. Other than the fact that my mind didn't have to actually do anything with my body being in labor. My mind knows how to drive. And thanks to meditation or yoga
Mhm.
practice or whatever, I was able to kind of separate the two, or at least control my mind to the point that I was like, no, you're only doing this.
Right. Yeah. Whoa. That's wow. I can't believe that. 2 hours and a bit in active labor driving to your home. But I mean, that was your, like you said, your only option. You weren't going to the hospital. Your friend wasn't comfortable with you birthing in her house. So, like, you got to get home. And that's the only way to do it. Wow. That's so amazing that you did that. Women are incredible. They can do anything.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, and that was really the thing, like what you just said, like I could do anything. That was what was in my mind. Like after parking that car in the driveway safely with nothing happening to anyone and walking through the door, I it was almost like it wasn't possible for me to return to this place of fear, because the craziest thing that I could have imagined in that moment, at least, had just happened.
yeah.
And so I walk through the door and my doula is right behind me and I start doing laundry.
Oh, gosh.
And she walks in and she just looks at me and she's so confused, because I mean, I had called her and my midwife and told them what was going on, updated them every half hour so they weren't worried that I crashed the car, like gave birth on the side of the road. And
Mhm.
so they know, both of them, that I'm in active labor. And this poor woman that I've known for 2 days walks into my house and she sees me like folding baby clothes and trying to do a load of laundry. And she just, bless her heart, lets me do it for like a full half hour, tries to like come in and help. But I'm in like control freak mode at this point, because I had gone past my due date with my first pregnancy. And so there was never a moment in my mind where it registered like this baby might come early. I was
Okay.
expecting to go much, much later because I wasn't inducing or doing anything to try to like speed the birth process along.
Mhm.
So I didn't feel prepared. The birth tub wasn't blown up. I didn't have my affirmation cards. I didn't have my twinkle lights. I'm laughing because it all sounds so ridiculous, but I didn't feel prepared for this dream birth that I had wanted to have. And so I was very frustrated.
Okay.
And after about half an hour of running around like a chicken with my head cut off, I found that I had to stop and fully breathe during the sensations, which were still not painful. It was just intense. Like that's the word that I could use, intense. Like someone squeezing you really, really hard, but then just letting go.
Mhm.
Um, so I said to her, I think I'm going to go take a shower. And she is trying not to laugh at this point and said, I think that's a good idea. I'll help you.
Mm.
And so I go upstairs. I get in the shower and she sets up some candles for me, gets my phone and puts on the Spotify playlist that I had made. And then I asked her to just please let me be. Like, I just want to be alone in here. If you could occupy my son and wait for the midwife and her assistant to arrive and blow up the birth tub, that would be great.
Mm.
She closes the door. I'm alone in the shower. And as soon as I was alone and the water was hitting me and I didn't have anything to distract me anymore, I just broke down in tears because the reality of what was about to happen really hit me.
Mhm.
And to be quite honest, up until that point, I don't think that it did. The reality of being a single mother, the reality of birthing without a partner, without friends, without family, with zero postpartum support, in a state where I didn't know anybody, in a house that I had lived in for a month, like it was so incredibly overwhelming. And all of that came out. I was in the shower sobbing. And I'm so grateful for that because in that moment, had there been someone there for me to say, please save me,
Mm.
the entire experience would have been different. But there was literally no one there. Not even my cat was in the room. And there was something about that energy and about the power of that that shifted something in me. And I can look back on that moment and say that's when it was because I desperately wanted someone to just fix it and someone to just save me, just like I had been, saved or fixed all of the times before. And there was no one there to save me. And I realized, like, I don't actually need to be saved. Like, this isn't an emergency. I'm not in pain. I don't feel like I'm dying.
Mhm.
I'm not bleeding profusely. There's nothing wrong. And so I was in the shower for a little bit. My doula came to check on me and I asked her if she would help me draw a bath because I didn't feel like standing up anymore.
Mhm.
And I was in the bath probably for about half an hour. And right like moments before my midwife arrived, because she had gotten lost getting to my house. She was only there for the last 30 minutes before my son was born. Moments before she walked in the door, I felt a pop and my water broke in the bathtub. And as soon as that happened, and I told her, she looked at me and she was like, you're not going to have time for your birth tub. I'm sorry. Like, this is about to happen very, very quickly. So you can decide if you're going to give birth in your bathtub that you're in right now, or we can set up the bed for you. And I just looked at her so confused because still it's intense, but in between every contraction, I'm absolutely fine. I'm talking the way that you and I are talking right now. I'm talking to my son, he's bringing in toys and doing all of the things, and there's nothing really that needs to be going on in my mind. But then she walks out of the room and comes back, and with the next sensation or surge, it was absolutely different. It was not just, oh, this is intense tightening anymore. It was like someone put me in a toothpaste tube and was squeezing me out. And so that level of intensity definitely elicited something different. And so I just started making these noises because it felt good to make the noises. And she comes towards me and says, you have to like get ready. You have to move the position that you're in, because I was sitting with my back to where the faucet was.
Oh, yeah.
And I was kind of turned because my bathtub wasn't that big. And I was in not a position where she could assist me with catching him. And I was half in and half out of the water.
Okay.
And so she told me, this isn't going to work. You can either be out of the water and I can help you, like we can help you stand up, or you have to be all the way in the water, but it can't be half and half. So after a few sensations here, I decided the bathtub was not going to work because I could not be in the position I wanted to be. So I tell them that I'm going to get out, and I get out and I'm hit with just like wave after wave of sensation. And that walk, which was maybe like 50 steps from my bathtub to my bed, was the most uncomfortable part of the entire entire labor and birth process, because it was like walking with a bowling ball between my legs that was like banging down to try to get out. And so I wasn't really walking. They were more like half carrying me over to the bed. And I finally get onto the bed. And this is the point at which like I feel like I left for a little bit, which was nothing that I had ever experienced other than in my DMT ceremony, which is why I mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very much there, but I wasn't. Like I could feel everything that was happening in my body. I could hear everything going on around me, but it was like I was watching it happen.
Right.
And since I felt like I was observing rather than doing, there was so much more that I could reflect on. So I started like thinking about other things, like while I'm kind of watching myself give birth. And it was such a trippy thing. Like there's no other word that I can think of, because it was such a psychedelic like experience of like witnessing this is what my physical body is doing. And then my mind is like almost having two split experiences at the same time. And so all my midwife kept saying was, let him come, let him come. And then I realized like I was holding him in. I never pushed. There was never a discussion of pushing. There was never a, okay, get in this position and like, we're going to lift your leg and hold your arm. Like none of that. My body started spontaneously pushing, which my midwife knew was happening, which is why she was like guiding me towards getting into a place where that could feasibly happen. And I just, again, was expecting pain. I was expecting, some signal that, okay, he's really about to be born. And so all she kept saying was, let him come, let him come. And there was this last moment of like constriction on my end. And I realized that like I was physically holding him in, but part of it was this fear that I hadn't let go of yet, this fear that I would tear. And for some reason, that was the one thing that was coming up in my mind over and over again, because I knew I had no postpartum support. I knew that tearing wasn't an option. So I was holding him in, and I had this moment where I had to accept it. And I was like, okay, if I tear, I tear, but this baby's going to come. I'm going to let him come. I'm going to listen to her, and it's going to be fine. And I feel this like instant release, and there's no ring of fire. There's no pain, nothing, no burning. It just like felt so good to not have that immense pressure anymore. And right as I feel that, I think I remember her or the assistant saying, I see a head. And it didn't really register to me, but suddenly for the first time throughout my entire labor, I felt someone touching me. And like having just come out of that liminal space, I was not okay with being touched whatsoever. And so I just screamed no at the top of my lungs, because I don't know what registered. I think I just didn't want to be touched. But what ended up happening is my midwife saw that my son had a nuchal hand and pushed his hand back in. And that made me so angry in that moment, because I was like, why did you touch me? We had this whole conversation, whatever. But that's instantly over, because in the moment that I did that, his body was born within the next contraction, which was maybe like 15-30 seconds. I don't know. But what's interesting is my older son had been in and out of the room the whole time, because he's a 5.5-year-old. When he heard me scream, he immediately ran up the stairs as fast as he could, because he thought something was wrong. And because that happened, he got to see his brother be born. So he was there in that moment, like when he fully came out, and he got to experience that whole thing. And she immediately hands him to me, and he's a tiny bit purple, and she like has the suction thing in her hand just in case. And I just take him, and I started sobbing, and all I could say was, oh my God, I fucking did it. That's the only thing that could register, because I was just like flabbergasted. I couldn't believe that I had just done this incredible thing, and this perfect little human was here. And I didn't want anyone to touch him or me. And so I just held him upside down a little bit and rubbed his back. And he started crying and he cleared his lungs and she was satisfied. And I was so in love. Like the oxytocin high was so intense and so incredible that even talking about it now, like I start to get like that buzzing feeling like on my skin again.
Wow.
And for the next hour, we laid in bed. It was probably longer than that. I think it was like an hour and a half, 2 hours, until his cord was completely white. And then we did a cord burning ceremony, which I have a video of. And that was essentially it. Like 6 hours later, they left and I went about life with an extra child. And I didn't end up tearing at all. And I didn't end up tearing. And my midwife told me later that she, from her experience of her 9 children that she had had in her 40 years as a midwife, knew that in a certain position, if it was just part of a nuchal hand, it could be pushed back in and then the mother wouldn't tear. And I find that so interesting because my subconscious thought of like why I was holding him in, I don't want to tear, I don't want to tear. I never voiced that aloud.
Right.
It was just something that I was holding within my mind space. And somehow I fully believe like we connected in that moment.
Right.
And her, what seemed like a violation of like my do not touch me at all rule, gave me exactly what I wanted. And my postpartum recovery was so incredibly easy because I didn't tear and I didn't have help. And it would have been, I don't know, it would have been really challenging, but it was such a spiritual experience. Like every single part of it, from like the moment of conception to the moment of his birth, it rewrote everything that I had believed about birth and myself in every way imaginable, and even those that I didn't think were possible. And 2 years later, he's an embodiment of that. He is so calm, so happy, so intuitive, so loving. And I really have to credit so much of that to his birth, because from the second he was born, he was just allowed to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's so beautiful. That's such an amazing story of you doing it, cultivating exactly what you wanted, trusting yourself, knowing what you needed, knowing what your baby needed, and bringing him into this world in such a beautiful way with you in your power. Wow, that's amazing.
And the fact that he was born on Easter Sunday too was just, it was so powerful to me because I mean, I am not religious in that sense. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation for another time about like Easter and Christianity and all of that. But just the power of like the representation of resurrection in that day with all of the stories. I feel like that birth was my resurrection. And in the process of like integrating that experience, I have done all of this work in healing my ancestral lineage. I ended up changing my name. I left work and all of that, like that whole paradigm altogether, to be able to stay home with my children. And now to hopefully hold space for other women to go through their own initiations. And none of this, and my PhD research that I'm now doing, comparing 5MEO-DMT to physiological birth, like consciousness. None of this would have even been a consideration for me had I not had that birth experience. And so it really has changed everything about me on a fundamental level, and really changed my older son too, because in his role as, a big brother, he's so enamored with his brother and so protective of him. And I know the fact that he was able to be included in that birth experience was such a transformational thing for him, because he now understands that birth is not a scary, traumatic, dangerous thing.
Yeah, exactly. He got that lived experience, and he could see you in your power, bringing in his little brother in such a beautiful, safe, loving way. That, totally. I can totally see that, just like reframing and changing up his DNA makeup and bringing in that healing for him. Well, that's so beautiful. Wow. Can I ask you quickly about your two births, comparative, the postpartum journeys that you had, and what did you do with each of your placentas? Did you do something special with them, bury them, encapsulate, or is there a special like Iranian tradition that you do with placentas or no, or
So with both of them, I ended up encapsulating the placenta.
okay.
I wasn't aware of any specific traditions within my lineage because quite honestly, it wasn't until my youngest son was probably about 5 months old that I really dove deeply into the exploration of my lineage. But what I find interesting about the postpartum experiences was that I had more support, as in like other adult human beings during my first postpartum experience, and nobody at all during my second.
Mhm.
And my first postpartum experience, I never went to get a diagnosis. I mean, as a former clinical social worker now, I definitely could have diagnosed myself with postpartum depression and anxiety and like maybe brief moments of postpartum psychosis because I did get to certain points where I felt like I should just die. Like my baby and the entire world would have been better off if I was not alive. But I was so terrified that if I told anyone how I was feeling, they would take my son away. And
Mhm.
so I never said a word to anyone. And it honestly took me probably about 2 years to get to a point where I felt like a human being again and felt like I was fully recovered from all of that. And with my second son's postpartum experience, I felt none of that. Um, there's maybe a moment after a couple weeks where I was feeling more emotional
Mhm.
and just feeling sadness that his father had chosen, not to be in the picture,
Mhm.
um, because I had chosen for certain things not to be allowed anymore, and like how I was being treated or how my older son was being treated. And
Mhm.
I feel like it was overwhelming, but I was never depressed. I never felt anxious. And like even the most crazy moments where, they were both crying and I was crying and poop was everywhere and the cat was meowing at me and I just
Yeah.
felt like my head was going to explode. They were just moments. And I'd take a breath, I would look at my baby, I would think about his birth, and I was like, none of it mattered. None
Right.
of it mattered anymore.
Wow.
During the 11 weeks of my second son's postpartum, he was also jaundiced.
Okay.
And my midwife wasn't concerned because he had so many wet diapers, and was waking up to nurse every 2 hours.
Mhm.
And so I never chose to get him intervention. I didn't go to a doctor. I didn't really take pictures of him that I shared with a lot of people those first few weeks because I didn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
At first I started to hear, the stories from people, and I just told myself like a sick baby is a sick baby. Like just because of color or like certain things that might be in the outside range of normal, this doesn't mean that there's something wrong with him and that I have to take him in.
Yeah.
And that was such a test of faith, which had I not had the birth experience I had with him, I would not have had that faith. I think I would have immediately rushed him in because I would have, again, had this fear like something's wrong.
Mhm.
Somebody else fix it. Somebody else save us. Somebody else help.
Mhm.
And there was never that moment. And so I watched him like a hawk, but I
Mhm.
held him through that. And, he's 2 years old and he's never had to have any type of medical outside intervention of any kind in his life other than, chiropractor appointments.
Mhm.
Um, and that was incredibly healing, as well, because my first son, didn't get to have that experience and, actually ended up having a pretty severe vaccine reaction.
Oh no.
So it was, again, a very healing thing for all of us to recognize that it's possible to actually thrive outside of the systems and
Mhm.
to not live in fear of like another shoe dropping and
Mhm.
something eventually happening because that had been my life for so long, and my older son's life for too long of his early years. And so much of that has just lifted now. Like now we, all of us, all three of us truly get to just enjoy being alive.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Wow. What an amazing story. I know I've said it, but it's just like just blowing my mind. It's so powerful. It's so powerful to hear your story and what you went through and how you completely changed your whole outlook and how you said that, yeah, you just like went through this cataclysmic moment that just changed everything for you and your life just fell into place and all of these things led you to where you are now. And it was because you made that choice. You made those choices for your life, for yourself, and you weren't seeking to be saved. You were like, I'm going to do it myself because I can now and because this is what's best for me and for my children. Yeah, it's just so fantastic to hear this story and to hear you speak it, to see you speak it, and yeah, the passion and the love that comes from you and this beautiful stories. So thank you so much. Wow.
Thank you so much. I love telling his birth story. I honestly, whenever somebody asks, I always tell it. I learned kind of early on, sadly, not to go around just telling everybody, because birth can be a very triggering topic. Some women aren't ready to hear that it's possible to have a painless, ecstatic, psychedelic like birth, and that's okay. Because to be quite honest, when I was still processing my first birth experience, there's no way that I would have been open to hearing the story that I just told you today, because I wouldn't have believed it was possible. I didn't think it was true. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay for all of the stories to exist, because when we are ready and when we are open, they're out there and we can seek them and we can listen to them and we can be transformed by them. And that's why I love what you're doing with this podcast so much, because you're giving women everywhere the opportunity to hear these stories, and it's so necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And thank you, because it's you, the guests that I have on the show that make the podcast possible. So wow. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about your birth, your story, for women that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I would want to add is I feel like there just really aren't enough resources out there for single mothers seeking to have unassisted birth experiences. So
Right.
much of the unassisted birth world and like those paradigms are structured around women who have partners. Um, and you don't need a partner to have the birth that you want. And even if you do have a partner who doesn't support you in the birth that you want to have, you don't actually need that partner to be there. And I say this because I feel like birth, having had the experience that I did now, birth is such a transformative rite of passage for women. And it's not something you ever get to redo.
Yeah.
And, that doesn't necessarily mean that because you had a traumatic birth experience that it's bad, that anything about that experience is less in any capacity. And some things are just out of our control. But for the options that we do have, for the things and the choices that are in our control, I would just urge everyone to trust that and to follow that, even if it doesn't make any sense, even if nobody else is supporting you in that. If you have the opportunity to make a choice for yourself that you feel is right for you, just do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are beautiful words. Thank you. And last question for you. If women want to contact you, how would they do so? If they want to speak to you about your birth or your 5MEO-DMT experience a little bit more, can you share how people can get in touch?
Yeah. So right now I'm in the process of rebuilding my website. But when it's done, it will be iamsettareh.com. And you can also find me on Instagram at iamsettareh. And I also have a podcast as well, which is Tea with Settareh, which is on Spotify and Apple. So yeah, you can find me in any of those ways.
Amazing. Yes, yes, yes. everyone that's out there, go to her podcast, have a listen.
Thank you.
So, thank you so much. Thank you, sisters, so much for listening to this episode of the Free Birthing in Color podcast. If you'd like to work with me one-on-one in a primal activation session, donate to the podcast, or to have your story featured here or in the blog, go to primalwomanportal.com for all the information to do so. Did you want to connect with our guest speaker? You can find all her information linked within the show notes. And if you have time, please subscribe, write a review, and tell a friend to have a listen so that this podcast and these stories of women birthing in their total power can be shared far and wide. Don't forget to check out the show notes for information on the Earth Daughters Women's Festival, the Breach Without Borders workshop, and much more. New episodes drop every Thursday morning, so stay tuned for the next amazing story to be shared on any platform that you prefer to listen to your podcasts on, or watch these episodes on the Free Birthing in Color YouTube page. And remember, your voice and your story matters. So if you're a woman of color or an Indigenous woman who's had a wild pregnancy and or birth outside of the medical system, submit your story, because it's so important that your voice is heard and celebrated in your radical journey of pregnancy, birth, and motherhood.